All right, well, good morning. This is the expert discussion on saltwater chlorine generators. Joining me on the group here is Jim. Jim Rabe is known on the forum, and Matt Joyful Noise is known on the forum, and Lee is there in the background. Levo is known on the forum. We're going to kind of go through a round here of where what we have for saltwater chlorine generators. First, we'll kind of focus on the equipment. So let's discuss a little bit about sizing a saltwater chlorine generator. That seems to be a big discussion between folks and their pool stores or their pool builders. Someone give me go ahead, Jim, give me a view of your view on sizing. You hear me, Jim?
You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't hear that. Oh, you would think that a 20K cell would be just perfect for a 20K pool, but of course we know that that's not at all true. Unless you want to run your pump 24 hours a day and the cell at 100%. That gives you no capacity to have swimmers one day and be able to make up the chlorine that you need. So we always run at least the volume of the pool. So if you have a 20K pool, you want a 40K cell. This is a lot more important where you guys live and where I live in the South and where it's really hot than it is, say, New York City. But it applies all the time. I think that having at least a 2x increase in cell size is what you want to do. And that's kind of what we say on TFP.
Yeah.
And I think it's that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just said I was going to agree. Yes, I mean that's a big thing, and I actually believe down here in the true South and the true high UV areas, be it Arizona, Florida, southern parts of Texas, especially, even bigger than 2 times is probably a wise idea. And variable speed motor pumps along with the saltwater chlorine generator makes a lot of sense. So hopefully we can get there. For some reason, Jim, you're on the screen all the time and we're not switching to speaker view. So I think I'm going to change my method here and just pin us to the screen so we're not showing just you the entire time. So hang on here. All right. All right, we got that one, and let me get one more here. All right, so we got 3 of us up now, so that's a little better. What we'll do here, what about troubleshooting, Jim? Any items along the line of troubleshooting? I realize the 3 of us only have Pentair saltwater chlorine generators, but we do have knowledge of what goes on the site about other types. In general, let's discuss troubleshooting items and things like that.
Okay, so in my pull it out of my guess, I think probably 5% of the time, such as my swing is bad, my cell is bad. They're not right. So troubleshooting really is in like 3 areas. Pool problems, the other is pool problems, and then finally you have actual electrical or mechanical problems with all cells. So unless you physically can see that the cell is not working, or not, that type of stuff, if you just think, gosh, I got 100% and it's not making any chlorine because I'm not getting any chlorine in my pool, that doesn't necessarily make the cell bad. The very first step in troubleshooting, in my mind, for those kind of problems is to make sure that the salt is not going to be able to make more chlorine than it can eat.
Yeah, great, Jim. You're kind of choppy, real choppy on there. So I'm going to kind of summarize what you're saying. Essentially, what you're saying is that the majority of time people come on and say their cell's having a problem. It's typically a chemistry problem, and and occasionally there are electrical system problems and things, and those are fairly easily diagnosed using diagnostic procedures listed in TFP. We've got a fairly robust wiki article section for most saltwater chlorine generators that tend to have pretty good troubleshooting um, uh, instructions in them for the actual saltwater chlorine generator. But I do believe it's, as we've seen, people come on and say, my saltwater cleanser is not creating any chlorine. Well, it actually ends up being a chemistry problem, as most of us know, that they're just barely holding on. Is that kind of
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
yeah, and I think the main thing is that from a troubleshooting standpoint is when people get to that point, um, certain types of saltwater chlorine generators, Hayward, Aquarites have a certain process. They tend to have some things on the control board that go bad, thermistors and some relays and things. And again, I believe our wiki is pretty well described in there, how to process that and go through that. Jandy is a little more closely held. Most of their equipment, we have a more difficult time getting through and being able to follow their troubleshooting, because they tend to want to focus all of their service not to DIY, not to us do-it-yourselfers, but to people that are more focused on authorized service centers and things. So what other items, Jim, can you think of from a troubleshooting standpoint?
So from the pool owner's point of view, I get tickled, and we see somebody that says, I run my pump for 4 hours. I can't understand why my cell is not making chlorine I need. You certainly don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how long to run your pump, but it is interesting how oftentimes people have a salt cell and no one ever, their pool builder, no one ever explained to them just the very basic concepts of how it has to work. Your cell can only make so much chlorine per day, and your pool is going to use whatever you're going to use. So you need to make sure you run your pump long enough to generate the chlorine you need, and you need to run the output of the cell at a high enough rate to make the chlorine you need. And our pool math takes you through all that. It tells you, how much your cell is making, and then from that you figure out how long you need to run the pump.
Exactly. And again, I'll reiterate a little bit because some of it was choppy a little bit. But again, it's a fact of life that the cell is not a smart entity. It only does what you tell it. So it has to, whatever its setting is and pump runtime based on what it generates, that's what it's going to make. What most people, as Jim said, pool builders, et cetera, don't do a very good job of explaining it. They just act like it's going to be magic and it's just going to happen. That's not true. So again, the Pool Map app is a great place to go because it has a fairly large cross section of saltwater chlorine generators to be selected in there. And you can select that and it will tell you based on your pump runtime and the generation percentage you put in, how much free chlorine that should generate in your pool volume each day. So that's great. Hey, let's move on to lifespan. Some people go, oh, they're not going to be worth it. They're too expensive. They'd only last 2 years. They've always heard, et cetera, et cetera. Lifespan. Let's discuss a little bit about the lifespan of a saltwater chlorine generator.
So I think that most saltwater generators last 5 to 7 years. Some don't last quite long, and some last a lot longer. I personally have been through 2 generator, a couple of red house pools in it, ones that went bad. One was almost 9 years old, right at 9 years old, and the other was 5 years old. And the one on my house is still running. It's about 7 years old. I think that it makes sense that you check to make sure it's not on scale every now and again. I check mine every 6 months. I think part of that is you get used to your pool and you know whether it has a scale or not. But I clean my pool, so when I do that, I also clean my salt cell.
Yeah, I think most of the name brand saltwater cleaning generators, other than a few of them that claim to be extended life, are good for 10,000 generators, right? So, yeah, that 5 to 7 years is probably a pretty good number if you're operating correctly. So I would think that, I do have to be very careful in today's market, very high priced rare earth minerals. And some generic forms of saltwater chlorine generators are being so marketed out there that have very little life in them. You have to be very careful with that. So I'm getting some.
So I just
somebody on their audio if they can turn down the speaker.
I just recently replaced my saltwater chlorine generator, and it was at the pretty much at the 8-year mark. So I got 8 years out of my saltwater chlorine generator.
Yeah, and as we say, the cost benefit, essentially it equates whatever liquid chlorine would have cost you over the time period, but the convenience and the ability to leave for a short vacation, or even in my case, we left for 75 days. It generated chlorine just fine. I had to have somebody come by and put some acid in every 10 days, but other than that, it took care of chlorine. So I think that's the biggest factor there. And lifespan for those folks that listen to this pod, this cast here, this discussion, realize that quality saltwater chlorine generators as these should last a good 5 to 7 years, if not longer. And many times they have life left in them. It's the electronics or some other failure go bad. So we'll kind of brush on periodic maintenance. Jim kind of adhered to that, talking about scale buildup. Most of the saltwater chlorine generators of today have a polarity reversal process to keep them fairly free of scale. That's not true. You're cutting out really bad. I'm sorry. You're cutting out really bad. We can't really understand anything right now. Yeah, I'll kind of jump in there. Matt, go ahead and jump in with me because Jim's audio is really cutting out. I have found that my generator, because I'm able to provide relatively controlled parameters with a little water softener, I'm not getting any. I don't even get any out of the returns anymore. So the polarity reversal should clear most of the time. And really, other than that, some people say, oh, they're supposed to clean them every 3 months, their pool builder told them. Well, that may not be a wise idea. Matt, can you help me out with that as far as acidizing, running acid through a saltwater chlorine generator?
Yeah. Marty, there's a bit of an echo going on. So
I don't know where that's coming from.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to mute everybody.
I did mute everybody but us three, but I'm going to go ahead and mute. Jim, I'm sorry, but I'm going to mute you and see if that clears it up. I think your system's got some kind of feedback on it. So hang on here. Let's see if that clears it up.
Yeah, I think that clears it up.
Yeah, okay. Well, Jim, listen, I'll ask you to unmute whenever I need to bring you into the conversation. Go ahead, Matt.
Where are we at? So as far as cleaning a cell, how often it needs to be cleaned, um, most of these cells are designed, they're pretty easy to take off the plumbing. So as long as you're willing to undo some connections, you could pull the cell off the plumbing, and then you could just look at it. I'll show you, I brought a little show and tell item here. I have my old cell, and let's see if you can look down the throat of it. You can look down the throat of that, right? And you can see the plates hanging in there, and you can see that white crust that's on those plates. Yeah, that's calcium scale. So what I would say for cleaning or for any kind of periodic maintenance is just pull the cell off. You could do it every 3 months, you could do it every 6 months, whatever makes sense for your swim season. Just pull the cell off and look down the throat of it. If you don't see any calcium scale, if you don't see any white buildup, there's no reason to clean it. Just take a garden hose, spray it out with the garden hose, and then put it back together again. There's really no reason to clean it unless you actually see an issue, that sort of white scaly buildup. If you look at most of the manuals that come with saltwater chlorine generators, they have a process in there for cleaning them using diluted muriatic acid. They kind of vary manufacturer to manufacturer. I think Pentair is like, uses a 5-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio of water to acid. My personal feeling is I think that's even too much. I would use something closer to like 10-to-1. Because, just to go through a little bit of how these things are made, basically you have a series of plates. That's your electrolytic cell. Those plates are made out of titanium, but they're coated with a catalyst. The catalyst material is typically ruthenium, sort of similar to what's in the catalytic converter in your car. And that coating is really what's doing all the work for you. And you have to be really careful because acids, especially a strong mineral acid like muriatic acid, will have a tendency over time to dissolve that coating away. Basically, that ruthenium coating, bare ruthenium metal doesn't exist in nature very well. It oxidizes very rapidly. So that ruthenium coating actually gets a very thin layer of oxide on it, ruthenium oxide. Now, it turns out that the ruthenium oxide is conductive enough and catalytic enough to keep the process of chlorine generation going. But a mineral acid like hydrochloric acid or muriatic acid will remove that oxide layer, just like muriatic acid would remove iron rust off of metallic iron or copper oxide off of copper. And so each and every time you expose those plates to a strong acid, you're removing a very thin layer of that ruthenium, and eventually you're going to wear it all the way down to the titanium. It's not a very thick coating. We're talking about, maybe 10, maybe 100 micron thick coating, a tenth of a millimeter, essentially. It's very thin stuff. And so it's easy to wear it out. And that's why we kind of say on TFP, don't clean the cell unless you absolutely have to. Otherwise, you're just exposing those plates to a very acidic environment that they don't need to be exposed to, and you're wearing them down. And that will impact the life of the cell. I can honestly say in the beginning, I pulled my cell off a couple of times, and I never saw any calcium on it. It wasn't only until the end of its life that it really started to develop calcium scale on it. So, save yourself the trouble and the damage that you can potentially cause by not constantly acid cleaning these cells.
Right, and that actually is a good segue into another question that popped up on the thread. A member asked, the role of the rare earth minerals, which you just explained. Is there a coating the catalyst that allows that process to occur to create the chlorine cell? The other is, and we've seen this a lot on the forum here in the last few months, is the cost of those materials have skyrocketed.
Yeah. So the plates, so the inside the cell, like I said, you have the plates, they're made out of titanium. The plates are coated with ruthenium metal. This is done, there's probably only, I think, 2 manufacturers, maybe 3 in all of the world of these types of plates, and they're not manufactured here in the United States. If you look at it, they're probably manufactured in Southeast Asia somewhere or China, just because it's a lot cheaper and easier to manufacture stuff over there than it is here. The materials that are used to make them, so titanium is not a rare metal. It's used all over the place. It's relatively cheap. It's the ruthenium, which is a transition metal. It's not rare. It's not like gold. It's not like platinum. It's actually there's enough of it around that it's, I wouldn't call it a rare metal, but it's only found in a few locations around the world. Central Asia is a big deposit of it. There are some deposits in the United States, but you can't get to them because environmental laws kind of limit what kind of extraction we can do here. So the bulk of those materials are coming from countries that, let's just put it this way, they're going to use their mineral resources for their own, their own purposes. They're not going to be very generous with them. So, these manufacturers have to constantly deal with spot prices on the markets for these metals constantly fluctuating. And just over the last couple of decades, rare earth metals like ruthenium, even the metals used to make lithium-ion batteries, they've all gone up in price. And as those things move up in price, these cells are going to get more and more expensive. Manufacturers can absorb some of that cost, but eventually it just comes down to, what the extraction price is for it. So, again, that just says, try to maintain your cell as best you can, try to maintain your water chemistry properly so that you don't damage these cells. They can be damaged. And that kind of goes back to the earlier point of, people were told, oh, these things are magical. They just make chlorine. You never have to maintain them. You never have to worry about your water chemistry. And, your general regular pool owner is always going to be like, okay, I'll do what the pool builder tells me to do. And, they don't take care of their water. They don't take care of the water chemistry. And that has an impact. Just like, poor water chemistry will damage your pump. Poor water chemistry will damage the plaster surface in your pool. Poor water chemistry will also damage your saltwater chlorine generator. So, the more work you do to keep your pool properly maintained, the water properly balanced, the overall, the better it is for all of your equipment, including your very expensive saltwater chlorine generator.
Yeah, and I guess the other question that was part of that member's question was, is there any other technologies out there to create chlorine potentially?
It's always funny. Technology, yes. So there's probably in some lab in some university, some 20-year-old grad student or 22-year-old grad student probably just discovered something great. Whether or not you can actually commercialize those things is really the big issue. The materials used for these saltwater chlorine generators, they're the same materials used by bleach manufacturers that manufacture bleach in bulk and sell it. This is a technology that has been around for decades. It's well known. It's well understood. There's just so much invested into it that anything that comes along that would try to replace it would have to be so incredibly disruptive in terms of efficiency or energy use or whatever the process is, to sort of push aside a technology that has been in place for decades. People have been electrolyzing chlorine for, since the 1800s. So, and this technology is very well understood. So yeah, there are other types of materials out there. One that's often cited in the literature a lot when you talk about water processing and, water purification technologies is a material called diamond-like carbon that's doped with boron. Boron dope diamond-like carbon it's great at creating chlorine. It'll create hydroxyl radicals. It's an amazing material. But could you commercialize something like that? Probably not. The expense would be, to get that started would be so high that it would make no sense to anybody in the business to replace what they're already doing. So really, there isn't much out there that's going to change in the near future. I think you have some manufacturers that make good cells. My Pentair cell has lasted a long time. Hayward cells are good. Jandy, I'm not a big Jandy fan, but there are plenty of people out there with Jandy cells. Our friends at what is it, Circupool, and some of those websites that we always put up for saltwater chlorine generators. There are generic cells out there. It's hit or miss, but at half the price of a regular cell, it might be worth it to some people to just give it a try. This technology, I think, is robust enough that it's just going to last for a long time.
And some of our pros that come on the site always state that all these cells are made in one place, and they're all kind of, as long it's by the shape, maybe not the Pentair ones, but the Aquarites, the Haywards are all, if they're all the same shape, they're all made in the same place, and the tags are just different, right? Don't know if that's true.
Yeah. I would bet even the plates that come from that Pentair uses, they're all coming from the same manufacturer. It's really just how they package it. If you look at the Pentair cell, it's kind of an all-in-one type deal. You have in the box here at the top of the cell, this is where all of your electronics are. So really what's being fed is, you're just getting power, really, and then the cell itself is doing all of the work to convert the AC power to DC, and it's got the flow switch in it. Pentair tries to package it all in one, whereas if you look at Hayward, the Hayward system, it's just an isolated cell, and everything is being controlled at the power supply board. So, in that sense, Hayward cells are very easy to exchange, to take in and out. They're not as expensive as trying to replace an entire Pentair unit. That's really where the differences come in. The technology inside of it is all the same. Jandy, Pentair, it's really a matter of how they package it and make it look good. For me, I was getting all Pentair equipment at the time, so going with an IntelliChlor just was, part of the package.
I'm going to ask you to unmute, Jim, and I'm going to bring up another subject here. The flow switch. We have a lot of discussion. People come on and go, "Oh, I don't need to have the power of the cell, the power to the cell turned off, because the flow switch is what my pool builder said will save us." And our standard response is that's not a wise idea. Go ahead, Jim. Give me your thoughts.
And I agree, it's not an idea. Cells explode if the flow switch gets on the closed position. I've been on TV for a while, and we've seen it a couple of times, not very often, but it's like, I say this is your car turned off. You can turn your car just there, better off, rather than the crash. You have to have two settings for the cell. One is have the power removed when the pump is off or not running, and then the second is the flow switch.
Right. You're cutting out real big, getting bad again on Jim. I'm going to have to go ahead and just I'll summary what you said. Essentially, right. We believe that there should be two forms. A flow switch is a secondary safety device. The primary is removing the power to your cell. And the problem with not removing the power to the cell is if by chance the flow switch fails or for some other reason it continues to generate chlorine without water flow through it, what can happen is that hydrogen gas can build up in your plumbing. And there have been sites, and we have some pictures and items have been posted to the forum, that your plumbing can explode. And just be straight up front, it can happen. And so we will continue to stress to people to do that. Many scoff at us and say, I'm not going to worry about it. That's fine. That's their choice. That's their equipment. But our standard statement is going to be, you do need two forms of safety protection on a cell. And just kind of how it is. So what can maybe Matt, you could explain real quick what happens when that builds up?
Well, you know, a saltwater chlorine generator, just to get into the chemistry of it a little bit, it's basically an electrolytic cell. It's electrochemistry that's going on. You have a series of plates. You apply voltages across those plates. One plate, you develop at the anode, you will develop chlorine gas as the chloride ion from the sodium chloride, the salt you add to the water, it gets oxidized and forms chlorine gas. At the cathode, you get the reduction of water, and that turns into hydrogen gas and hydroxide ions. Now, sometimes there can be oxygen generation, but the whole point of having that catalyst coating is to sort of suppress that. So you get chlorine gas at one side, hydrogen gas at the other side. Now, the difference is chlorine gas is very soluble in water. As soon as it's generated, it's going to dissolve in water. It's going to form hypochlorous acid. Hydrogen gas does not dissolve in water very well. If you took hydrogen gas and you bubbled it through water all day long, it would never, the amount of gas that actually dissolves into water is very, very, very small. So what winds up happening when you don't have water flow in the cell is the plates are generating chlorine and hydrogen gas. Some of that chlorine is going to dissolve into the water, but can only hold so much when it's stagnant. You have hydrogen gas building up. So what you wind up getting is a gas pocket in the cell that's now filled with hydrogen gas and chlorine gas. A mixture of hydrogen gas and chlorine gas is incredibly explosive. You can think about maybe back in high school when you were a kid and you did electrolysis experiments on water and you created hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. And the teacher would always, let a little bit of the hydrogen gas off, hit it with a cigarette lighter, and it would make a nice little pop. Well, think about inside of that cell, you now have a big pocket of gas, and it's filled with hydrogen, but it's also filled with chlorine gas. Those two gases together, it doesn't take much in fact, UV light is enough to ignite a mixture of hydrogen and chlorine gas. And when that goes off, it's a lot of energy and it's going to just explode. And we see pictures of that where, where in their plumbing setup, there used to be a saltwater chlorine generator. There's now just two broken pipes and nothing left. And they found parts of the chlorine generator about, halfway across the yard. It's a very dangerous mixture. It's very explosive. It can cause a lot of damage. If somebody were ever near that when it went off, serious injury is very possible. This is why, again, to loop back to what Marty and Jim were saying, you've got to have two forms of safeties. The primary one being the removal of electrical power, the secondary backup one being the flow switch. Unfortunately, the way the manufacturers make these cells and make their setups and their automation, some of them it's a lot easier to do that with, others it's not. And then, of course, with the more prevalent use of variable speed pumps that remain powered all the time, it used to be back in the old days, you could just rig it up so that whenever the pump turned on, your saltwater chlorine generator turned on. Well, now your pump is electrically powered all the time so that you don't have that natural on-off cycle that you could take advantage of. So, there's a lot of posts on the forum about how to get around that, different ways to detect, when your pump isn't actually running. And you really, if you're thinking about a saltwater chlorine generator, you want to make sure you have both of those safety features in place. removal of power, and a flow switch to protect in case, whatever happens to that primary safety.
Woody posted up here, why do you need to produce hydrogen gas? Why can't we just produce chlorine gas?
I'm sorry, what was that, Maureen?
Woody posted up here, why do we have to produce hydrogen gas? Why not just the chlorine gas?
Oh, that's just that's the chemistry. If you're going to convert chloride ion into chlorine gas, that electrical current has to go somewhere and reduce some other chemical element. In that case, it's the hydrogen part of the water molecule that takes on those electrons that were given up by the chlorine. It's basically an electrical circuit. In order for the chlorine gas to be generated, hydrogen gas has to be generated somewhere else. There's no other way. That's just pure chemistry right there. There's no other way to.
And to bring up the fact that, and this has been brought up on the forum, well, then why don't I lose salt? Don't I consume salt?
That's true. So when you think about it, it's a closed cycle. It's a closed loop, right? So you have chloride ion from your salt gets turned into chlorine gas. That chlorine gas gets dissolved in the water. It eventually turns into hypochlorous acid and hypochlorite ion. That stuff goes along, does its disinfection or its oxidation. That chlorine, that active chlorine, remember, is then converted back to chloride ion. So you never lose your chlorine in that process, which is funny because, again, pool builders, people in the industry don't understand the underlying chemistry. So they'll always tell people, oh, keep a couple extra bags of salt on hand. It's going to use up all the salt over time. And that's not true. The salt in your water goes away because of splash out, because of dilution from rain and overflow. It never goes away because the saltwater chlorine generator is using it. It's a closed cycle. Any chlorine that gets used by the saltwater chlorine generator stays in your pool and eventually becomes chloride ion.
Right, and in fact, in our pool, my salt level goes up over time.
Yeah, where we are, and all the water evaporates away.
Between the water evaporation and the addition of acid, I get.
Yeah, I honestly, in those 8 years that my saltwater chlorine generator ran, I inadvertently, or I should say, stupidly added a couple of bags of salt the first year because I thought, like a lot of people, I thought, oh, something odd here. It's not reading salt right, so I have to add salt to it. And then after that dumb mistake, I never added another bag of salt again, and it honestly stayed at 3,600 parts per million and above for all of those years. So where we are, we don't need any salt, just initial load.
Let's move on. We've got about 20 minutes left here. Let's move on to the chemistry. I know there's probably not a lot of difference from our common chemistry, but I'll kind of bring up a few items that are mentioned out there on the forum. One is that the free chlorine minimums and targets are different for a saltwater chlorine generated pool than a normal, as we want to call it, chlorine pool. And there's a lot of discussion.
That's been batted around a lot. I don't think we have a great answer for it, to be honest with you. I don't think there's some sort of eye-popping mechanism for why one works one way and one works another. As you said, when you're manually chlorinating with liquid chlorine and you're dumping that in every day, we tend to say, your minimum is 7.5% of your stabilizer level. But if you're running a chlorine generator, you can go down to 5%, and it seems to work. It's probably more just, how we, the water balance that we tell people to use and how people add it. A liquid chlorine pool where you're dumping it in manually, that's a big load of chlorine all at once, and then you're kind of expecting it to last all day. So I think the levels tend to naturally be higher because, the amount of usage is going to change. Whereas with the saltwater chlorine generator, if you're running your pump a long time, like a lot of people do, for me, it can be anywhere from 6 to 10 hours a day. You're constantly adding that chlorine slowly, a little bit at a time. So we say, you know, have a higher cyanuric acid level, have a higher stabilizer level so that your chlorine loss is very low throughout the day. And then just let the, you know, let the saltwater chlorine generator add the chlorine slowly. And just from our own, thousands of pool owners who've had these, just seems like 5% works fine. And it's never really been a problem. Whereas with manually chlorinated pools, just seems that 7.5% works better for that. There isn't really any underlying chemistry mechanism that would say, oh, you've got to have one versus the other.
And so I think that's something we have to stress, as all of us on the forum, is that many people will look at the pool map and they have a saltwater picked up on their pool map, and it'll say 3 to 10 is their target. And they'll write 3, which is the absolute minimum. That's 5%, let's say. And that's dangerous. And Jim will, I'm going to go ahead and ask Jim to jump in here. But Jim, we know that, right? We know that if we don't maintain a high, that writing that minimum, and you speak this a lot on the forum, writing that minimum is not the place to be.
So I try not to get anywhere as close to the minimum. Because I'm basically lazy, and I have a swing because I'm basically lazy. I want the pool to work, and if you try to adjust your FC every day, it will drive me crazy. So my is just, you should stay at your target or slightly higher all the time. And if it's below that, you're still far away from the. Is that?
Yeah, correct. Just I'm the same way, right? I tend to ride somewhere around that between 8 and 10% of my cyanuric acid, my CYA level, and I think that's just the smarter place to be. It just seems to be a lot more simple. So, moving forward. We're going to say, and we talked about this right at the start, the fact that people have to realize that they have to adjust either their runtime or their generation percentage to what free chlorine they need to have generated. Starting depending on where you live, say us, where we live, where we run our systems year round, through the winter, it may turn off because of the low water temperature or et cetera, et cetera. Mine only usually turns off for a few weeks at most, but then you may only need a half or 1 ppm of free chlorine every day. And then about mid-April, well, actually early April, mine wakes up. In other words, the sun gets higher in the sky and I start taking off. And by this time right now, I'm putting 4.5 parts in there every day, just because of the intensity of the sun. And I've got a shallow, small pool volume, which I think also has an effect on that. And the temperature, our temperature of our water right now is 93 degrees because of the heat that we've been having. It just skyrockets this time of year. It'll come down here once we get this massive heat wave off, but I think that has a lot to do with it. And so we have to make sure people understand they do have to adjust their free chlorine levels needed as time goes on. If my understanding is correct, that's that low temperature cutoff is not really a chemical or mechanical problem. It's to keep people from generating too much chlorine when the water's too cold. Is that correct, Matt? Do you know?
Well, a chlorine cell like what we have has, there's a certain efficiency to it. When water gets really cold, you can actually start to get other chemical reactions occurring that you don't really want. One of those would be oxygen generation. Instead of generating chlorine, there can be other side reactions that turn chlorine into chlorates, which is a different oxygen chlorine compound. Those things can happen at different temperatures, either when the cell is too cold or when the cell is, or if the water were too hot or something like that. But really, the cold water cutoff, I think, is set by most manufacturers just because at that point, the efficiency of the cell starts to go down. And if you're if you're paying a lot of money for the cell, you don't want to run it in a very inefficient manner and then, sort of use up a lot of that generation time, basically inefficiently generating chlorine. And you might actually see it. You might actually see that in the actual free chlorine levels. Once the water temperature starts getting really low, you might look like your cell is not generating any chlorine at all. It's really a protective measure for the plates inside the cell and for the cell itself.
Okay.
Honestly, in my pool or where I live, the cell cuts off about mid-December because that's when the water temperatures drop below 50 degrees, 52 degrees. And at that point, I shut off my saltwater chlorine generator. I set the percentage down to 0. Sometimes I'll disable it. And then I just go with manual chlorination. And even at that point, I'm adding very, very little liquid chlorine over the winter time. It's the water's so cold, nothing's growing in it. The chlorine use is very, very low. So there's no reason to even run the cell. If I wanted to, I actually have the winterizing pipe. I could take out the cell and just put in this piece of straight tubing where the cell would normally be. And that's not a bad idea sometimes, especially poor people in Texas this winter who found out what freezing water can do to pipes. I'm sure there were a lot of damaged saltwater chlorine generators too. And there have been times where I've thought to myself, if it gets a little too cold tonight, I might actually take the cell off just because I don't want it to get damaged. So there's good reasons to not run a cell in the wintertime when it's cold, when the water is cold. It's just inefficient and you're probably doing more harm than good to the cell.
Okay. What about pH management? As we know, folks come on the forum and say, well, I had a saltwater chlorine generator installed this spring, and I'm having to add acid all the time. That saltwater chlorine generator is raising my pH of my water.
Yeah. There's two things there. As I said, at one plate you get the generation of chlorine. At the other plate you get the generation of hydrogen gas, but you also get the generation of hydroxide, OH minus ion, right? That does actually raise the pH of the water. So the pH of the water coming out of the cell is going to be higher than the bulk of the pool water. But when that chlorine gets used up, either through oxidation or sanitation, those are very acidic reactions most of the time. So any pH increase that you get from the generation of chlorine in the cell is going to eventually be matched by a pH decrease once the chlorine does what it does. So on average, on net balance, a saltwater chlorine generator is a lot like using liquid chlorine. It's pretty much pH neutral. What people are experiencing, and again, Marty, you've said this many times on the forum, once you stop using trichlor tablets, these very acidic forms of chlorine, you're no longer adding acid to your pool anymore. And so then just the natural process of pH rise that occurs with water that has carbonate alkalinity in it takes over. And that's what people are seeing. They're seeing their pH increase because they've stopped using a form of acid that they didn't realize they were using in the first place. And so now you've got to go and instead of using a chlorine tablet that is acidic, you've got to add muriatic acid to your water, which is acidic, to lower the pH. So, you're just kind of trading one form of acid for another. And so that people don't recognize, and I wouldn't expect most people to understand, a chlorine tablet adds chlorine to the water, but it also lowers its pH too. You're not told that. It's not written on the bucket anywhere when you buy all those tablets. So, people don't realize it. Then they switch either to liquid chlorine or a saltwater chlorine generator. Their pH goes up and they're like, oh my goodness, something must be wrong here. But it's not. It's just the chemistry is a little different. So we try to teach that on the forum. Some people accept it and some people get really mad about it. Like, now I got to add acid all the time. And of course, people are very freaked out by muriatic acid. We've had this discussion before too. I don't want to use muriatic acid. That's dangerous. That's poisonous. You'll kill yourself. You'll burn your eyes out. All that other stuff. So, you have to get people comfortable with that new process, that new way of doing things.
Yeah, Woody popped in here and said, is there a best time to test for pH?
Um, no, I mean, I don't think you should change your testing regimen really much based on your saltwater chlorine generator. I mean, yeah, if you stuck the sample tube like right in front of the return and tried to catch the water coming out of the return, you might see a little bit higher pH, maybe. But I think you should just stick with whatever your normal testing routine is, and adjust pH based on that. Not try to go to any great lengths to figure out, oh, when is it, when is the right time? I think just as long as you maintain consistency, you'll be okay.
Yeah, and along the lines of pH management, borates seems to pop up every once in a while as a big subject. And I know, Matt, you use, I believe you still use borates, and I never have, but I thought about it. Some others have, and basically they view of it as a panacea nearly, but it's not going to stop their pH problems. And
Yeah, it kind of takes on a sort of that magical chemical a label to it. It's like, oh, borates, I'm going to add that. That's going to make all my concerns go away. It's just another tool you can use if pH rise is a problem in your pools. There are a lot of pools out there that don't need to use borates. I mean, if you're manually chlorinating your pool, and you're sort of like, I think about, people back east in the Northeast, mostly vinyl liner pools, stuff like that, where you're manually chlorinating, you don't need borates. It's not going to really do a whole lot for you. Where I live in the desert Southwest, where it's really dry and pH rise is always an issue, borates do help. They're just another buffer, another type of buffer chemical that adds to your alkalinity a little bit, but also keeps your pH from getting too high. You're not really going to know it. It's sort of like where borates buffer pH is a lot higher than where pools operate. So that kind of pH buffering is going to be pretty minimal. Where it really matters a lot is actually inside the cell, because inside the cell, the pH of the water is going to be a lot higher than the bulk of the pool water. So having borates actually helps to hold down the pH rise that can occur inside of a saltwater chlorine generator. And that's good for a number of reasons, because that's really, you're going to get calcium scale inside your chlorine generator, mainly because the pH is a lot higher in there when it's running. So if you can add something to the water that's going to hold that pH rise down, you're going to limit that scaling that can occur. And that's to the better for your cell. Generally for the pool water, yeah, it can change the feel of the water, make it feel a little bit more slippery. That's, some people like that. It can help with pH rise, but you're still going to have to use more acid to lower your pH. So you're not really saving anything acid wise, but you're just kind of extending that period of time over which you have to add acid. In my pool, if I don't have any borates in my water, like recently back in May, I did about 11,000 gallon exchange of water. So everything went down, including my borate level. It was probably below 20 at that point. And I could tell I was adding acid like every 3 days or something like that to the pool. As soon as I brought the borate levels back up to 60, which is where I usually keep them, it can take 7 to 10, maybe sometimes 14 days before I have to add acid. So, it does have a noticeable effect on pH balance, but I do have to add more acid. When I'm adding acid, I'm adding something like 40 ounces at a time to create the effect that I want. So it does require you to use more acid at a single period of time than you would previously. So there's a lot about borates that people tend to get excited about, but there's really specific uses for it, and otherwise, I would tell people not to bother.
Well, our last little subject here, and we're coming up to our time commitment. And our dear forum founder loves it when I discuss this, because he shakes his head. It's about calcium saturation index, CSI. And he hates that term. He hates us even talking about it. But I believe, especially here in the southern and the southwest, the desert areas, and also with those with saltwater chlorine generators, CSI is a number that if you monitor can help you in many ways. Primarily, and if you maintain a slightly negative CSI, your chlorine generator will rarely get very much, if any, scale built up in it. It's basically taking the place of the borates in a way, I suppose, but it's probably simplistic, I'm sure, on that.
Well, so for everybody on the call here, it's CSI is calcium, or I should say calcite saturation index. So it's basically just a measure of how much calcium carbonate your water can hold. If it's negative, that means that it's deficient in calcium carbonate, and so it can stay dissolved in water. If it's very positive, that means it's oversaturated with calcium carbonate and you can get scaling occur. If it's at 0, that means it's just balanced. The water as it has a perfect amount of calcium carbonate compared to how much can be dissolved into it. So, that number is just it's a calculated value based on pH, calcium hardness, total alkalinity, temperature. You take all those factors into account, calculates the CSI, and it's kind of like kind of liken it to maybe like the old voltage indicators on your car battery, on your dashboard would tell you, if your battery was undercharged or overcharged or what, or it's just an indicator to kind of give you a feel as to where your water is at in terms of saturation. If your CSI is too positive for the bulk of the pool water, which is what you're measuring with your test kit, then inside of a cell, a saltwater chlorine generator cell, it's going to be way too high. And then that's where you're going to get scaling inside of your cell. If the bulk of the pool water is negative, what you're measuring, and you have a negative CSI value for all of the measurements of your pool water, well, then that inside your cell, it's probably okay. Even though if the pH goes up, it's not going to, there's not going to be a great potential to deposit a lot of calcium scale inside your cell. Again, these numbers matter for people that have, plaster pools, where, scaling can be a problem on your tile and stuff like that. When you get to folks who own vinyl pools, that number doesn't mean much to them because a lot of times they live in areas where the water isn't very hard. The vinyl surface isn't really going to scale much. It's a value that you don't really have to track and you don't really have to worry about all that much. So I can see, for some people who may not be used to that, and then they put a saltwater chlorine generator on their pool, and then all of a sudden they got to start thinking about these numbers that normally they would just kind of ignore. It does help. It's related to the equipment you have on your pool, right? I don't have any stainless steel ladders or anything like that or handrails or anything in my pool. So I never have to worry about things rusting, right? So if my pH is a little low or, it's a little lower than I thought, I'm not thinking to myself, oh my gosh, my handrails are going to rust. That's because I don't have them. But if I had them in my pool, I might actually think, oh, maybe I should keep my, my water, pH a little bit higher so it's never too corrosive towards metals, but I don't think about that because it's not something that's on my pool. So when you put a saltwater chlorine generator on your pool, you might have to start thinking about these other values just to be on the safe side and to keep your pretty expensive investment running and operating properly.
Well, we've reached our 1 hour time commitment, and I want to thank Matt and Jim for joining me for this past hour. I apologize to Jim with the audio difficulties, but thank you for participating. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording at this time and unmute everybody so we can have a general chat if we'd like. So thank you very much.